Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Modern Web Accessibility with JavaScript and WAI ARIA. I'm Sharon Spencer with IAAP, and before we get started, I just want to quickly review a few system items for today's webinar. Everyone should be logged into Adobe Connector. You can follow along with the presentation that we provided to you and over the phone. To access the presentation, there was a link to the handout page in the confirmation email that you received when you registered, and there's also one in the reminder email that was sent out a few days ago. During today's webinar, if you do want to ask any questions, our speaker, Paul Adam, does plan to stop for questions throughout and at the end. If you have a question, you can type it into Adobe Connect. You should all see the chat access area that's on the right side of your screen. And so if you just want to make a question or comment, type it into the text box for the chat area, hit enter or click on the send icon. And when Paul gets to a good stopping point, he'll address your question. To guard against background noise, we have put those of you who are on the phone and connected through voice over IP on mute. But as I said a few moments ago, at the end of the webinar, if there's time, we can open up the microphones in the phone line to ask your questions verbally. If you are hearing audio over both your computer speakers and the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen via computer only, or you can turn off your computer speakers and listen via phone only. And there is a speaker icon at the top on the toolbar, and you can use that to mute your speakers, or use the options section within Adobe Connect. And you also, as Paul is presenting, if you want to see the screen better, there is a a full screen option. There's also a zoom in option that will follow Paul's cursor on his desktop. Lastly, I want to remind everybody that we will be recording this webinar. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us for Modern Web Accessibility with JavaScript and WAI ARIA. Our speaker today is Paul Adam. Paul is an accessibility evangelist for DQ Systems. He focuses on mobile accessibility, and that's both Android and iOS, and modern web accessibility, including JavaScript, HTML5, CSS3, WAI ARIA, and WCAG 2.0. So we are very delighted to have Paul with us as today's speaker. Thank you, Paul, for agreeing to do today's webinar for us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sharon. Let me share my screen then. And is everything looking good? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So anyway, thanks a lot, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to the new International Accessibility Organization. So, I know most of us are probably professionals in the accessibility space, or that's part of our job, or maybe our full-time job. So definitely happy to present to y'all. And you can find me on Twitter if you ever have any other questions. You can tweet at me at Paul J. Adam, and that is also my website, pauljadam.com, and I work for DQ Systems. So, as an overview, JavaScript is the one language that works everywhere on the web, on every web-enabled device, even like maybe a black and white ebook reader. And you need WAI ARIA to be able to make your JavaScript dynamic sites and apps accessible. If you don't use ARIA, you're not really going to be able to make them fully accessible. And now we're at a time where modern screen readers have excellent support for ARIA. Even on mobile devices. In fact, it might be better on mobile devices than desktop in some cases. So I'll talk about how we use the ARIA spec to make JavaScript widgets accessible, and how you can use HTML5, like the form input types, the video and audio controls, how you make those accessible. Common problems with custom user interface controls, keyboard operability, screen reader accessibility, and do they work on a mobile device as well? So our learning objectives, we're going to talk about how to make
Screen dimmed.
Sorry, that's my voiceover. How to make dynamic HTML widgets like dialogues, mega menus, carousels, date pickers. They have a lot of different names. Sometimes they call them light boxes for dialogue. But you need to make them keyboard operable and work with the screen reader. And then we'll talk about the input types for HTML5, attributes, how that works on mobile in desktop browsers like Chrome. And then with ARIA also, we'll talk about how you can speak messages to the screen reader, how you can make the screen reader say anything you want. Like when there's an error message or you've inserted new text on the screen, you want to speak that out loud. And we'll talk about how this relates to mobile, iOS, and Android. So a lot of the JavaScript widgets that we'll be covering are listed here. I've kind of talked about them already, but tooltips is another one. Tab panels, character countdown indicators, like when you're on Twitter and you type and it says you have 30 characters remaining, 29, you can make that text speak out loud. And the major problem with JavaScript accessibility is keyboard and focus management. So when widgets pop up, you need to send their focus to them, and when users use their arrow keys, they need to be able to operate that widget. This screenshot on the right that shows the major browsers, their icons, Opera, then Firefox, Chrome, IE, and Safari. And there's a picture of a car engine in the middle to kind of symbolize that JavaScript is the engine of the web, and it really works everywhere. So I did want to do a poll. So I'm going to switch to the poll interface. And my poll is on what is your level of experience with ARIA. So let me switch to that. And you can go ahead and answer the poll now, I think. So just check. You have a radio button, so you can only choose one. What is your level of ARIA experience? Either you've never used it, you're a beginner, intermediate, or an expert. And I just was kind of curious, how the audience, how much y'all have used ARIA. Okay, so right now it says that 7% have never used, that 42% are beginners with ARIA, 42% are intermediate, and 7% are experts. So that sounds about what I would expect. If you were experts, you probably wouldn't be coming to the talk because you might know everything already. And if you've never used it, you may be a little scared about, ARIA is very complex. I don't know how many different attributes. There's a lot of attributes. So learning them all does take some time and a lot of, hands-on testing with the screen reader. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to desktop sharing, show my slides. Alrighty. So what are some of the common problems making ARIA really work? So a lot of people I see, they use ARIA attributes, but they don't actually test them with a screen reader. That's the major problem. You can't just put an attribute on your page and then never test it. Like role equals application, or they put role equals main on the navigation element when the main goes on the main content. So you'd find a lot of those things out. In misuse of ARIA hidden, you would find out there's problems if you test it with the screen reader. Other things like you want to make the screen reader speak some error messages. So you put role equals alert on a div, but it didn't speak it out loud. You have a role equals alert, you reload the page, why isn't it speaking the error message? And it's because you have to insert the messages through JavaScript in a certain way. And then another thing related to speaking messages is you change the CSS from display none to display block to make it visible, but the screen reader is not speaking that message. And that's again about how you insert the string with JavaScript in the alert containers. And another thing, you can't just put role equals button on an element and expect it to work with the spacebar. When you use a real button, the button tag, that does work with the space bar and the mouse and the enter key. It works with 3 different events. But a roll equals button on a div does not do that. You have to add those events manually with JavaScript. And other issues with using ARIA hidden equals true or roll equals presentation to try to stop the screen reader from speaking something, but they will still speak it if those elements are focusable, like a link or a button or an element with a tab index, because you cannot put hidden attributes on focusable elements. Now, here is a nice diagram to kind of explain how web accessibility APIs work. This is from the ARIA documentation. It's called the contract model with accessibility APIs. APIs are application programming interfaces. So this diagram on the left, you have the user agent, which is the browser DOM, the document object model. So that has all your HTML code. And then JavaScript is what's used to manipulate the DOM, what the user sees, to change the strings, change the data. Now, the way you communicate to the screen readers through the accessibility API, well, that goes through the browser. And so all your elements have roles, like are they buttons, are they links, they have states, are they expanded or collapsed or checked. And then the assistive technology reads the accessibility API, and the accessibility API depends on the platform, like what operating system you're on, if it's Mac or Windows or iOS or Android, and then based on the browser and how it interprets the accessibility API. So if they don't all work together, then there's going to be bugs and it won't work perfectly, and that's very common. So other things you want to consider with modern web accessibility, still accessibility has been out forever, and still the major problem is keyboard accessibility. This is why we have jobs testing for accessibility, because developers don't use a keyboard, and whoever looks at the website or the software doesn't use a keyboard either. So everyone uses a mouse and everything works fine for them because they're just using the mouse all the time. But when you test with keyboard, you find that the user interface controls are not focusable. You can't tab to them. You don't see the outline. You'll see when you hover over it with your mouse, it changes color, but when you tab to it, it doesn't change. So you don't have the hover style looking like the focus style. And other issues with keyboard accessibility, don't ever use positive tab index, like tab index equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't use that. I have another slide that'll show why. You want to use real buttons if possible, but you can use divs, fake buttons, but you have to say div roll equals button, you have to give it a tab index equals 0 to make it focusable, and you have to give it 3 different JavaScript events. And another problem is an href is focusable with the keyboard, but if you use an A without the href, it is not focusable at all, and that's a very common problem. Because again, everyone uses the mouse, and it works when you click on it, but not when you tab to it. So this is a slide to show focus outline visibility. The screenshot at the top right shows the default focus outline. There's a light blue box around a link. This is in Safari on a Mac. And WCAG does require that all elements be visible on focus, so you have to have the basic focus outline at least, but that's not very good. It has bad contrast. So the enhanced focus outline on the bottom shows a sort of 3-pixel solid blue outline that's much darker and actually has contrast that may pass. And another thing with focus visibility is that skip links, you may think a skip link is only for the blind user. It's for keyboard users, really. And so they have to be visible when you tab to them. If the skip link is never visible, then obviously a keyboard user is never really going to use it. And most screen reader users will be using heading navigation or landmarks, possibly. And most skip links are actually broken, so you have to actually test the skip link, press enter, did the skip link really work? You'll find most of the time they don't. So outline none is something you never want to use. That would get rid of the default focus outline and you would see nothing. And it is a very common problem. For positive tab index values, this is a screenshot that shows a form where they put tab indexes, but on some inputs, but not all the inputs, and the order is messed up. And they start with a tab index equals 6 rather than a 1, and they don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the focus starts jumping around. And I've seen this cause keyboard traps and other just reading order failures. So you want to let the source code order always dictate the focus and reading order. It should read and speak to the screen reader in the order of the code. And you use tab index equals 0 to make HTML elements keyboard focusable, like a div. If you have a custom widget, you're making you know, a custom dialog or something, you're going to have to use tab index to make elements focusable, but you only want to use either 0 or -1. And -1 will remove an element from the focus order until you manually send focus to that element using JavaScript focus method. So you have to learn specifically why you want to use 0 and why you want to use -1, but never use a positive value. So now let's talk about the accessible name and text alternatives for images. So you need to learn a concept of the accessibility APIs called the accessible name. And that is just, if you have an image with an alt attribute, then the alt attribute becomes the accessible name of that image. So that's always what the screen reader speaks as the name of the element. And there's different ways that that will be calculated. So I'm showing a page here with a demo of using the different methods. And the accessible name calculation for IMG elements, first it says, look for an ARIA labeled by. And if you don't find ARIA labeled by text, then look for an ARIA label. And it goes down the order. So ARIA always wins. And then it goes to HTML4, the alt attribute. And then if you don't have an alt, it'll also look for a title. I would never recommend you use a title for alt attributes, but it does look for it there. And if there is none, most screen readers will speak the file name. So let me show you a demo of how, VoiceOver would speak these elements here. Plug my headset so I can turn VoiceOver on the Mac.
VoiceOver on Safari. Pennybacker Bridge via ARIA LABELLEDBY image.
And I like VoiceOver on the Mac because it shows you the visible text output of the screen reader on the screen. Makes for great screenshots for developer reports. And so when I go through the images, and we also have a rotor on the Mac, just like you do on the iPhone.
Characters, images, web spot, images.
So then I can press the down arrow on my keyboard to go through images.
Pennybacker Bridge via ARIA label, image.
So now it's reading the ARIA label.
Pennybacker Bridge via alt attribute,
Alt
image.
works.
Pennybacker Bridge via title attribute, image.
Title does work on the Mac.
360 bridge.jpg, image.
And this is an image with no alt attribute, so it's just reading the file name.
Talkback reads Pennybacker Bridge via title attribute, graphic, image.
And this was just to show that also on Firefox on Android.
You are currently on an image.
The title.
VoiceOver off.
Looks like I have some questions in the chat. I don't know if I should address those now. All right, I saw some, but might be too hard for me to read through here, so I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay, and then I provided this link in the slideshow to show some good documentation on the HTML 5.1 specification of all the different methods of writing text alternatives. So straight from the W3C, like how would you make this complex pie chart accessible? Or how would you write the alt text? And they have recommendations of how you would describe text alternatives, which can get complex when you're dealing with charts and other elements.
Paul, can you put your headset back on? It's a little hard to hear you.
Yes. Okay, headset is back. Thank you. So on HTML5 accessibility, we have all these new input types. You know, when you're typing an input, you type in specific input. Is it a number? Is it letters? Is it a website? Is it an email? You can, tell the browser what sort of keyboard to present to the user. And that's great for usability and accessibility. There's also some attributes, like the required attribute. So, we want to tell screen reader users when a form field is required. Also, if an element is disabled and you can't click on it, you have to tell the screen reader API, the accessibility API, that it's disabled. And you do that through these HTML attributes. You can also use ARIA. There's an ARIA-required, and there's an HTML5 required. You can use one or both, and they both do the same thing, and they won't say required twice, so you don't have to worry about that. Placeholder is an attribute, which is supposed to be the expected input format, expected value sort of thing. Autofocus is a great alternative to tab index equals 1. With autofocus, you can say, I want this input to be the first one. When they load the page, it sends the focus straight to that input. But it's different than tab index equals 1 because it doesn't cause all these problems. And then patterns, you can say input type needs to be in a particular pattern, like a pattern of a regular expression, like a social security number or something like that. Now, and then there's sectioning elements in HTML5, like main. The main content, that's the point of skip to main content links, is to let the user get to the main. And so by using this main element, you're making it very obvious what is the main content. And there's header and footer HTML5 elements also. Native form validation, the required attribute. Audio and video, these are tags for HTML5. They have accessibility problems. Also, they're good for accessibility because they work everywhere, and you don't need Flash plugins and things like that. But they're not totally keyboard accessible. And when you have audio and video, you have to also make sure you have captions and descriptions. And how do you do that? With HTML5, you have WebVTT for video text transcripts format or text tracks format. And here is an issue with HTML5 video, keyboard, and mobile accessibility. So when you use a native video element, the play button is not keyboard or screen reader operable, at least not in all browsers. And I'm not sure exactly what browsers it works and which ones it doesn't. So this screenshot here shows in Safari, this is Apple's default video player for HTML5 video. It has a play button. However, when I tab to it, I can't get to that play button. It also has a captions button, and when I tab, I can't get to that captions button either. So with JavaScript and HTML code, you can just make your own custom player with real buttons, and then you just say when the user clicks my play button, then play the video. And I'll show you a demo here of how that works. So I'm just going to tab through the page. And it looks like it would work now because my focus is on the video window. But when I press enter or spacebar, nothing works. When I hit spacebar, it scrolls me down the page. But now, so I made a custom control. Now I can tab to these two buttons, play and disable captions. And I can hit spacebar and play, and then it'll start to play. And then I can enable and disable the captions. And I can pause and play it. Now, that does not work. See, the way Apple's default video player works is that these controls will only display on hover with the mouse, and there's no way to tab to them. So you really need to have a custom video control. This is going to be a problem with any HTML5 video. Also on mobile, it is a problem. So let me show you, I have this video open on mobile, and I can show you an issue.
Custom video control, reload button.
Let me reload the page.
Web page loaded, HTML5 video accessibility.
So this is on my iPad, and so when I swipe, before it would actually skip right over this play button. I think maybe they fixed it in some recent releases.
Start playback button.
But if you have two videos on the screen, they're all going to say the same thing. Start playback button, start playback button. If you want to make the buttons unique, you're going to have to use custom buttons.
Custom video controls. Head play button.
And so then I could make that button say whatever I wanted it to say.
Play. Disable captions button. Disable captions. Enable captions. Pause button. Pause.
So in there you can see the different captions. We're using HTML5 web VTT captions, and me as an end user, I said that on my Mac I want it to be this this certain style here. It's yellow with the impact font. And then on my iPad, I have a different style font for my caption. So this is great for low vision users. So on ARIA, what does ARIA stand for? Well, WAI stands for Web Accessibility Initiative, and ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. RIAs, Rich Internet Apps, used to be a hot term back when Flash and Flex were out. The Flex apps were called Rich Internet Apps. And so I think that's kind of where they got that terminology. But the ARIA has survived, whereas Flex has died. So ARIA is now like it's the accessibility API of the web, but also works in multiple things like SVG and EPUB. It's not just for HTML, so it's very powerful. So the main things in ARIA are your landmarks, live regions, form validation. We're talking about hidden elements, how you can hide things in ARIA. There's a failure in WCAG called name, role, value, and state, and almost all custom controls fail this success criterion. And ARIA has different levels of user agent and assistive technology support. It doesn't work the same everywhere because, not just like web browsers don't work the same everywhere. HTML pages don't always work depending on the browser and the AT and the platform operating system. So on the navigational landmarks in ARIA, you have a lot of different roles you can use. And this screenshot on the right shows on an iPad where you can use the rotor to navigate by landmarks to get directly to the content you want. Like, you want to get directly to the main content. There's a role equals main. The footer is called role equals content info. It's not a very user-friendly name. Like role equals footer might have made better sense. But that's what it is. So you can give them also accessible names so that you can give it a unique name instead of just saying content info. You could say aria-label equals site-wide footer, or you can call it whatever you want. Now, when you have multiple navigation elements, multiple navigation landmarks, if you have two navs, then the user might say, well, what is this nav for? What is that nav for? You can give them unique names with an aria-label. So you might have, footer navigation or main navigation or some sort of differences. So let me show you how you can navigate these elements on the iPad. And I have a demo called Quick Navigation by Semantic Elements. Let me open it on my iPad.
App switcher. Safari running. Safari run. Safari. Quick navigation by semantic HTML elements with screen reader. Quick navigate handwriting. Braille screen and headings. Links. Form control tables. Lists. Landmarks.
So
12 landmarks.
So you can switch to landmarks, and on the iPad, it tells you, how many elements there are when you switch to the rotor. So then I swipe down.
Banner. A banner image and introductory title. Landmark.
Interestingly, there's a bug in VoiceOver where it skips over iframes, and my landmark example above is actually an iframe pulled in from another site, so it skipped right over that one. This is a bug. So I had to actually put focus in that iframe manually.
Content information, content info, landmark.
So now that I'm in it, I can cycle through these landmarks up and down.
Search, landmark.
And this is a focus bug right now. You're not seeing
Search.
I think this
Landmark.
is because of the iframe issue.
Content banner. Search. 4 periods. Landmark.
Let's see here.
Voiceover off.
Sometimes I have to turn voiceover off and then kind of like scroll it into view to get it where I want and then turn it back on for testing.
Voiceover on.
Oops.
Safari. Quit navigation by cement landscape.
But then if
Home
it
button
steals
to the
the
right.
focus,
Penny back.
you have to scroll down with 3 fingers all the way to where you need to go, or use headings to get to where you want to go.
Page 9 of 11. Banner, landmark.
So that's the banner landmark.
Navigation, landmark.
And there's some sort of focus bug here with the iframe, so I'll just move on to the next demo. But that's ARIA landmarks.
Voiceover off.
Paul, there's a question. Do you recommend ARIA labeled by over ARIA label?
Good question. So there are some different reasons why you'd want to use ARIA labeled by versus ARIA label. In my demo with the accessible name calculation for IMG elements, this first one is ARIA labeled by. And the reason I did that is because there's some actual text on the screen. I can say that this image is ARIA labeled by this text. And you can do that with any element, like a landmark. You can say that that landmark is labeled by this particular text, like if there's a heading right below it, and you do that through the ID references. Now, ARIA label would be if there's no visible text on the screen, so you don't have any text you can reference to, and you just have to type it in manually. It's sort of invisible text that only the screen reader user would see. So those would be the 2 different reasons why you'd use it. And I will tell you, ARIA label is kind of easier, for developers to use because it's just one simple attribute. They don't have to worry about ID references and connections. Okay, so let's talk about color and contrast. This is called modern web accessibility. So contrast is a modern problem. The Nielsen Norman Group usability guru just did a nice blog post on contrast and how this is a trend brought on by minimalism. Modern design is about minimalism. So to try to be minimal, they have removed the contrast, which is actually harming usability. A problem, though, with placeholders is that placeholders always fail contrast. You have to use CSS to make them darker. You can have bad contrast, but only on disabled form controls. So if you have bad contrast on a button, then you better make sure it has a disabled state as well, so the screen reader user knows it's disabled. If you have like red error messages, you need to make sure that you use ARIA invalid on all those inputs that have a red border around them. Your links need to have good contrast. The hover and the focus states should have good contrast. And the keyboard outline needs good contrast. And I say, like, this is design winning over readability or design winning over usability. It's a very common problem. And text size and readability. There's a major problem with mobile accessibility where pinch to zoom has been disabled on a lot of websites and web applications. So this is a very common gesture users do to try to make the text bigger is they pinch to zoom on their screen. And this is often disabled because designers and developers want full control over the page. WCAG requires that the text at least be resizable up to 200%. So you do not want to disable pinch to zoom. Other issues is that contrast of larger text can be worse if it's big text, but if it's smaller text, it has to be better. So you have those differences on large text versus small text with contrast. Responsive design has excellent benefits for text resizing because as the user hits on the Mac Command++ to make the text bigger, on a responsive site, everything gets bigger, including the text, and you don't get the vertical scrolling or the horizontal side-to-side scrolling on a responsive design site. And if you disable pinch to zoom, you would have to provide widgets to allow text resizing, like large, small, medium text, plus minus to make the text size bigger and smaller. And then there's other things that you can do with the operating system controlling the text size. So this page uses some Apple system CSS font values. This only works on the iPhone. You'll notice on my Mac, it looks like it's Times New Roman. Let me open it on the iPhone and we can see some differences, or on the iPad, so it works with iOS. There's a thing called handoff for the Mac where you can easily switch between a page on your Safari on your Mac to Safari on your iPad, and your iPhone is very handy. So on the iPad here, if you go to your settings, you can enable larger type. And since we use the specific CSS properties for Apple only, the text size has gotten bigger. And this is dynamic. So if I open my settings and change the text size, again, text size, and make it smaller, then I go back to that web page, it will dynamically change. So this is a handy way that you could take, you can meet a WCAG success criterion. Again, it would only work on Apple devices though, but it's interesting if you're just targeting that platform. So talking about mobile, top mobile accessibility barriers, pinch to zoom, we said. A lot of the mobile problems are your standard desktop accessibility problems. Form validation, it's always a problem. Error messages, they're not spoken to the screen reader user. Things that are really problems on mobile are placeholders without labels. Useless page titles, like every page title is the same, so which page am I on? Expanding and collapsing menus, the hamburger menus, do they tell you when they're open or when they're closed? The modal dialogues with focus management, the users are reading content underneath the dialogue when that should be disabled and not readable at that time. Single page applications, fake div buttons. Now, something that's very handy and useful for mobile usability and accessibility are HTML5 input types. And this screenshots here show input type equals number on the left. This is on Android. And you get a nice usable keyboard just for typing in numbers. We don't have to see the ABCD keyboard. Now on Android, the input type equals date time shows a date picker that pops up in a modal dialog. This looks completely different on the iPhone. And that's fine. When you try to control the input, like you make a custom date picker, it's going to be a lot harder to make it accessible. Whereas with HTML5 input types, you're saying, Google, you make it accessible. Apple, you make it accessible. And that does make it easier on you. And then there's other inputs like input type equals color. This gives you a date picker or like a color picker on Android. And then on Chrome, on the desktop, you'll see the date picker is much different than on Android. You get sort of the traditional calendar type view date picker. So let me show you these input types on the desktop to show you how they work and don't work on mobile. So on desktop Safari, basically they don't look fancy or anything. You don't get much. You get this number one. When I go to number and I hit my up and down arrow keys, the numbers will change. And you get a nice slider for the range, but that's about it. Now, if I look at that in Chrome, however, Google adopts these new sorts of input types a lot faster. So in Chrome, we've got the color picker, pick a color. We have this date picker. Now, you can tab through each subcomponent, or you can press the option down arrow, and then you can arrow through, and also the page up and page down works. So you pick the date you want, press enter, and then the date's there. So this is, Google built this component, and if it's not accessible, you have to file a bug report with Google to get them to fix it. Now, let's look at this on the iPad so you can see the differences there. Because that's where these input types really shine. Oops. And they look different on the iPhone as well. But I'm just going to show them on the iPad. So this is your default, A, B, C, D, the QWERTY keyboard. Color doesn't work on iOS yet. Maybe one day it will. This is the date picker. So this is kind of like if you're putting a calendar entry in to your iPhone. And these are mostly accessible too. I'll show you.
VoiceOver on. Date. Pop-up button.
So this is a
Double
pop-up
tap to
button.
activate the picker.
Double tap to activate.
Date. Pop-up button. Date. Pop-up button. Clear button.
Now, I can't interact with the other content now because Apple has made this modal.
Dismiss pop-up. Double tap to dismiss pop-up window.
When I tap on the external grayed out space, it says dismiss pop-up if I want to dismiss it. In the ding ding ding, that means you can't interact with this content.
August. Selected. Picker item. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value.
So it's telling me how to operate the element.
September. Selected. 12. Selected. Picker 13. 2017. Selected. Picker item. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. 2017.
So, and then to actually activate it, I have to click outside of it to dismiss it.
Dismiss pop-up. HTML5 input types ammo.
Now, Apple has bugs though where we just lost our focus to the top of the screen. And this is in a native control with all selects on iOS. You lose your focus, so that's a very bad bug. If you had a fully custom element, you can control the focus and always keep it where you want it, or you maybe could send it back to that element.
Email text field. Double tap. Insert email text field is editing.
So email gives you a little @ symbol.
Month image month. Clear button.
There's another bug where I couldn't tap on the month select, so I had to tap on the month label and then double tap on that label. And that's another way you can activate inputs on the desktop and the mobile is by clicking on the label to actually set focus to the input. That should work on mobile as well. And if you build custom controls, I would expect to have that same behavior that these do.
VoiceOver off.
So this is the number. Then password. Password just defaults to not being capitalized because they wouldn't expect your password to always be capitalized. Telephone looks much better on the iPhone than on the pad. And then there's also like URL, which will give you the .com on your keyboard, so you can quickly type a URL. So a major problem on mobile with forms is labels versus placeholders. And they disappear when you start to type into them. They're really two different things. A placeholder is supposed to be like the example of an input. And if you see this open table screenshot, they only had placeholders as their labels. So once I started typing information in, now you can't see what the label's supposed to be. So that's a cognitive accessibility problem, WCAG failure, contrast issue. And on forms, you want to make sure your required fields are clearly indicated. The asterisk is good for a visual indicator. ARIA-required equals true tells the screen reader that it's required, and -invalid says that it's in the failed state. You can also use HTML5 required or just put required in the label as actual text. That's the old school method.
Paul, we do have, looks like 5
Okay.
questions now when you get
Yeah,
to a
I
good
can
stopping
pause.
point. Is now a good
Yes,
time?
yes.
Okay. Okay. So Beth had a question. This was from about 5 slides back. And she said, is 200% on iOS the top level of drag the slider below slider without the larger accessibility sizes?
Yeah, I don't think, I think on iOS, I'm sure it's much more than 200% on the top level of the slider, but I don't know. I've gotten questions like, how can you specifically measure what is a 200%? And that's very complex. Um, I would say things that I do to determine like is something large text or small text. I use Jim Thatcher's favorite, large text favorite, and what it would does is insert this little widget to tell me what is large text. So I just compare it next to it, but that's for contrast issues. But I would say I don't know the exact science to calculating those sizes. I would just say the intention is that text sizes must be flexible and resizable and all of that. And, if you think it's not 200%, then it's probably not 200%. And, there's a lot of human judgment there.
Okay, then she asked also, do we have any sense why the number or drop-down mobile controls don't give Siri, i.e. voice recognition, input?
Well, I think your question might be, can or why can't the users control those drop downs with voice control, like activate them, like Dragon Naturally Speaking on a PC, maybe is what you're asking. Um, I mean, I would personally love to be able to control everything with voice control, like with Siri to tell it what to do to operate on the web page. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but you can't do it now. You can put in feature requests with Apple, kind of like bug reports, and ask them to do that stuff.
Beth actually provided additional information. She's saying the regular keyboard has a microphone for input fields, not the other fields, or not the other field types.
Oh, yes, yeah. So that's dictation. So Siri will allow you to input just straight text, but yeah, with if it's not a text input, you can't operate on it with voice dictation. Yeah.
Okay, Chris asks, could you use an on-change event handler to override the iOS focus bug?
That's a good question. Um, I don't exactly know. We'd have to try that out. I haven't experimented with trying to stop the iOS focus bug. I probably need to though, because it is a real common problem. Um, so yeah, I don't know. And I've seen others when as soon as you change a value, you lose the focus as well. That's sometimes why people recommend a go button next to the select and put the event on that go button instead. I would just say you'd have to experiment.
Scott said, regarding the browser embedded input modals, the developer complaint, I know, invariably will come up is it doesn't fit with my web app's look or feel. And then there's impetus to develop a custom widget. Is there any way you know off the top of your head to influence the built-in element theming, or are they pretty much just closed black box implementations?
So yeah, good question. Like modal dialogue. My demo, I have modal dialogue demo. They're mostly black and white. They're not pretty. They're just functional. I'm worried about, does it work with the keyboard? Does it work with the screen reader? And all of that behavior. Now, they can be designed to look any way you want. And you can use other, like maybe a jQuery UI dialogue, and that has a lot of customization. But really, the sky's the limit when it comes to the design. And honestly, I can make any modal dialogue, however it looks, I can make that accessible with code and not change the design at all. So there's no compromise there. Just the contrast issues, those designers do have to change.
Okay, and Paul, we actually have several more questions. Do you want to keep going a little bit further with your presentation, or try to take some more of these questions now?
I'll keep going just because I have lots of slides, and I want to make sure I can get through as many as possible. Okay.
Why don't you, when you get to a good stopping point, let me know, and we'll go back to the questions. I'm paying attention where I've stopped
Okay,
off.
sounds good. Thank you. So, form validation is a major problem with accessibility. And these are, tooltip error messages you see in the screenshot. You need to make sure these are spoken to the screen reader user as they tab through the form. And when they hit submit and these appear on the screen, they need to hear those messages, or you need to send their focus to them. And there's lots of different methods to do accessible form validation. Let me show you one here. So I would turn on VoiceOver.
Menu, 8 items. Closing, leaving HTML content. First name star, required, edit text.
So of course it says required, and then when I press I can tab down to the bottom.
You are currently, last name star.
Or I can press enter to submit the form.
First name star, required invalid data, edit text.
When I hit enter, it tries to submit the form, and then it sends my focus to the first input that's invalid. And you see now it says invalid data. That's based on the ARIA-invalid equals true attribute. So as the user fills in data, and then press enter.
Paul, last name star, required invalid data, edit text.
I just keep sending focus back to the inputs as they need to be filled out.
F, your name at email host.f.
Now,
5, asynchronous, insertion at end of text.
That, this is also using HTML5 native validation that says, since this is the input type equals email, add this photo, this is not an email because it doesn't look like an email. So I got to make it look kind of like an email.
At, misspelled, asynchronous, at, s.
Now it looks kind of like it could be an email because I have a @ and a domain. I don't have a .com yet, but and also I changed the color to turn green to visually indicate that it's now valid. And also the attributes for the accessibility API are dynamically changing.
5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5.
And that's reading the placeholders. This has this phone number
5, 5, 5. Phone number.
10 digits, including area coded, no dashes. So that will be spoken through the ARIA described by.
10 digits, including area code, no dashes.
And that is called help text command or help tag in VoiceOver. You don't hear it always though.
Ask for 5, 5, 5, 5.
You have to either wait or you have to manually invoke it with VO Shift H.
10 digits, including area code, no dashes. 77777. VoiceOver off.
So I'm gonna do another demo.
Paul, can you go back on your headset?
I'm gonna do another demo though first, and I will. So here's even simpler methods of doing this as well.
VoiceOver link jQuery.focus. First name star required edit text. First name star edit text required invalid data.
And again, you don't hear these ARIA messages until you wait.
You are currently on a text field inside of HTML content. To enter text in this field, type. The help tag is, please enter your first name.
This is a feature of VoiceOver. Other screen readers always speak these ARIA described by text automatically.
Last name passwords are required invalid data, edit text.
You have to manually invoke it.
Please enter your password in the required format. 8 digits, 1 length. J, leaving 8, simple form validation using only W, first name star, F, last name star, F, password star, F, email star, A, D.
And that's pretty much it. It just sends focus back and forth.
You are currently on a text field inside of H.
So there's lots of different methods to do validation. Just the important part is that the screen reader always hears some errors and that they see the invalid states as they tab through and they hear the error messages. Other methods are roll equals alert, and you have positive and assertive live regions. And these are ways you can speak messages without focus management. So let's say you don't want to send their focus anywhere. And so let me show you a demo of that. And with this one, we're not actually going to shift the focus anywhere. I'll show you without the screen reader. When I hit the submit button, my focus was still down on the submit button. Or if I press enter, my focus isn't going to go anywhere. It's just going to change the error messages. Let me turn on the screen reader so you can hear.
Voiceover on Safari. Reload page. Enter. Using last name, first name required. Edit text.
And I didn't use any ARIA required here, just a normal label. This is a very simple demo.
Email submit button.
So you hit spacebar on the button.
Please enter your first name. Please enter your last name. Please enter your email address.
But my focus was still down on the button.
Email required. Edit text. First name.
So if I type my first name
Hit L.
and then press enter.
Paul. Please enter your last name. Please enter your email address.
It just keeps speaking those messages. I just erase the previous error message and insert new error messages, and then it speaks those out loud.
Last name required. D. Please enter your email address.
So that's a method of doing error messages without focus.
You are currently on a text field inside of it.
Other things you can do with ARIA Live regions is do audio descriptions for blind users for videos. Like if there's text in the video, you know, the blind user can't see the text in the video. So you have to speak that text out loud somehow. Or if there's a scene and nobody's talking in the video, then they can't hear what's going on. So you have to speak those descriptions. And this is a challenge of, you know, modern video accessibility. This demo, Cintel, shows how you can speak the descriptions using ARIA. And they have two methods. They have pre-recorded, which is they actually merge the description audio onto the video, and it's not separate. And then text-to-speech descriptions is making the screen reader speak it. And I'll show you how this works.
Voiceover on. Link. Image. Link. Leaving toolbar item palette.
Again, they have a custom play button, which is required because I would never get to the native play button.
Video playback. Leaving toolbar item. Video. Leaving toolbar item palette.
It skips right over it. So hit play.
Pause.
And let me go back. Forward.
Back forward 10 sec button. On a ridge, a figure trudges through the snow, using a long pole to steady her steps. The slim teenage girl leans into the wind, clutching her leather cup. Tall and muscular, the bandit swipes at the petite girl.
And this is voiceover circulating these messages based on the ARIA language text that's changing below.
He flings her aside and draws his own dagger. She squeaks backwards. The bandit falls heavily onto his side and lies still. The girl, Cinta, voiceover off.
So of course this does not, you don't hear anything if you don't have voiceover on. Because it's just based on this text, this ARIA live region changing. Your other option is to do manual merge into that video with actual audio track. And that works on Android and the iPhone. This is a screenshot of that demo working on Android. With your form controls, another thing that you can do to make the error messages very apparent is change the title of the page. Like when you have a form and it has errors, you can actually change the whole title of that page. So you just do a JavaScript, you say document.title, and then you say errors present in form. Add that to the old title. Other things you can do is change the colors based on the state, based on the HTML states of valid or invalid, and based on the CSS. Okay, so time for a poll, and this is on what types of screen readers you use. And so I'm going to stop sharing, go to my poll, and this is a checkbox poll. So this is check all that apply. I'm curious as to what screen readers you guys in the audience are using. I use a lot of these. I've used almost everyone except Window Eyes. Personally, I've not really used Window Eyes before, but I know it has ARIA support now. I don't exactly know the levels, but I would say if you want to become an expert in accessibility, you really need to learn, 2 or 3 screen readers, and mobile screen readers too. So looking at the results so far, we have 32% have used OS X VoiceOver on the Mac, the desktop VoiceOver. 48% have used iOS VoiceOver. No, it's 51%. And, it's way more popular on the iPhone. VoiceOver, most users are going to be using VoiceOver on mobile. So if you had to choose only one, pick iOS VoiceOver. And then JAWS has 87%. So that reflects that JAWS is the most popular screen reader. That is the reality. If you're dealing with clients and they want to know, what my audience might be using, they're probably going to be using JAWS and IE as a combination. NVDA is the second most popular here with 62%, and that is the open source free screen reader. NVDA works really well with Firefox, and so they're a free accessibility testing platform. JAWS you have to pay for. So if you're on Windows and you don't have the money for JAWS, then I would definitely recommend NVDA. Window Eyes is now free if you have a license for Microsoft Office. And TalkBack on Android, if you're an Android user or you're focusing on mobile accessibility, you definitely want to learn TalkBack. It works much better with Firefox than with Chrome. So I would avoid using Chrome with TalkBack because it's very buggy. And 12% chose other. So there's some other screen reader that I did not list. So yeah, you can mention that as one of the question statements if you'd like. So let me go back to the presentation so I can, I gotta do screen sharing. And then I will get to some questions, I promise. Okay. So another thing to talk about in modern web is responsive web design, RWD. And a challenge for you would be to find a website with an accessible, responsive web design. It's a very hard challenge. Test it with VoiceOver or TalkBack. Here are 2 sites that are accessible. And mainlinebaseball.com, someone recommended this site to me based on that challenge, and it turns out this is pretty much a very accessible site. So responsive design, you get to change your browser width, and these are called breakpoints. Here's a desktop breakpoint. Now we're in the iPad breakpoint, and now we're in the phone breakpoint. And the major problem with responsive is hamburger menu. They have a skip to main content. It didn't actually work. That's a common problem. Skip links don't actually work. But let's go to the hamburger menu and then press enter. They did do some focus management with it. And I'm trapped inside the expanded sidebar of the hamburger menu, which is exactly what you want. You don't want the user to be able to tab through this other content on the right. And then they can close it, and then my focus went back. So you see that focus is not being lost. This is keyboard operable. Let me show you the other demo. Let's see how it works. The foundercenter.org. This was for Knowbility's accessible internet design competition, AIR. And let's see, it's loading here. I'm going to load this one in the iPad, this other one, so y'all can see the differences. The Founder Center is taking a while to load. Okay, let me pull up my reflector. I have to get the iPad back onto the screen. Okay, so on the iPad, so when you rotate it sideways, it looks like, okay, it's not thinking that's in a desktop mode. It's definitely in the iPad breakpoint, both horizontal and vertical. Let's turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on. Banner. Reveal navigation. Button. Landmark.
So this is the hamburger menu. Reveal navigation button.
Close X button. Landmark.
So that you see the focus management and all that. Now I'm trying to focus on the content to the right, and you hear the ding, which means I can't. And that's exactly what you want.
Main menu. Navigation. Close X button. Landmark. Close X. Landmark.
So, and then this is the Founder Center. It's got an accessible hamburger menu as well. They have the skip to content link that appears on focus. It actually works when you click on it. You know, they had these widgets, the search widget, and when you open it, the focus goes into it. And when you hit escape, well, it should have closed, but I guess it didn't. And then the hamburger menu, that of course operates fine with the keyboard. It doesn't work with the escape key, so that's a problem. It's hard to find something that's perfectly accessible everywhere, but these are two generally good examples. Now, you know, making ARIA work on mobile iOS and Android can be hard. There's certain things that don't work everywhere, like ARIA expanded equals true, and ARIA has pop-up equals true only works if the element is a role equals button. If the element is a role equals link, it's not going to work on iOS, but it does work on the Mac, and maybe it works with NVDA, but you know, you have to look at all these differences if you're targeting mobile users. And role equals dialog doesn't work in that it doesn't announce that it's a dialog, but role equals alert dialog does say it's a dialog, an alert dialog. I do have a list or a table of ARIA support on the Mac in two different versions of iOS 7 and 8.3, and then on Firefox and Chrome. And I try to keep track of where different ARIA attributes work and where they don't. It is somewhat difficult to do, but I do update them, you know, when I do presentations and things, and when new versions come out. On my phone, I have iOS 9 Beta 1, and they fixed field set legends. Field set legends were broken in 8 and below, and well, they didn't totally fix them, but they kind of work now. So again, I'm talking about user agent and assistive technology testing. How do you find out if something actually works? You have to test it with a screen reader. And I have a link to, if you want to learn JAWS very well, I would recommend the JAWS Surfs Up Surfing the Internet training class. This is what I took when I first learned JAWS. And it shows you how to do everything like table navigation and landmark navigation and work with different languages. And then I also have another ARIA support matrix just to show how they work in different areas. But you really just need to test. You need to test with JAWS, with VoiceOver, and with NVDA at least. Skip links are a problem in that they don't work. So I have a demo to a working skip link, guys, and well, this is like a table of contents, and it's just to show the first one doesn't work. Like when I go to the main content, I'm still up at the top. And that's because you have to have a tab index -1 hack for Safari and Chrome. And that actually makes everything work correctly with the keyboard when you're trying to send focus. This is a very common problem I find. Link purpose. This form controls list shows VoiceOver showing all the form controls on a page. And there's a bunch of buttons that say add to bag and edit details. This is for a e-commerce website. So I want to know, what product am I adding to bag? And what product am I editing the details for? I don't know. And what you need to do is modify the accessible name using ARIA or some other method so it says, you know, edit details for product so-and-so, and so that it's specific. Just like we say we don't want to have click here links, because I'm click here, where am I going? It's the same. We don't want just buttons that just say edit. Custom controls. This is a major problem for accessibility because they're not keyboard accessible, and they're not screen reader accessible. So these are like fake buttons here. And it tells the screen reader that's a button. It says fake BTN button. But if I press enter, that worked. When I hit space though, that doesn't work. I had an enter event, but not a spacebar event. So that's a problem that you have to look out for. A normal button, this is just a plain old regular button. When I hit spacebar, it fires the on-click event. And when I press enter, it also fires the on-click event. But then, like, here's a div with a roll equals button. For one, if you don't have a tab index, it's going to skip over it. And then when you press enter on click, nothing happens. Spacebar scrolls the screen down. Now this has an on key up enter, and so it works. But again, spacebar does not work. So you have to do all this extra work. That worked, but again, I didn't prevent the focus. There's tons of work you have to do when you could just use a regular button. Now, it is possible to make any of these elements perfectly accessible, though. It's just you got to do the extra work. Okay, so Sharon, should I pause for questions now? Does this go till 11:30, or should I keep going? What do you think?
Let's just do one or two questions. Okay. This ends at 11:30 your time, 12:30 our time. There are some questions and comments in here, quite a bit regarding a question that Devin posed. Okay. But it was suggested that we use the forum after the webinar to continue that conversation. And I think that's a great idea. So I just want to jump back to a question that Zach asked, because it was several slides back. So I want to be sure we at least capture that one and maybe a couple others, and then we can keep moving forward. But Zach asked, and again, this was several slides back, how about float labels?
Okay, yeah, I see that question. So that's, I would say, float labels, I'm thinking like that's when a placeholder, when you tab into it, then the placeholder moves out and the label's now like above the input or below it. And that's fine. What WCAG requires is visible labels. So the label has to be visible somewhere, and also WCAG requires an accessible name. So you can always have invisible accessible names, that's easy. But people kind of like to hide the labels. But WCAG pretty much requires that they be visible. So float labels would work. I also see a question related to placeholders about the contrast. And like which WCAG failure does contrast with placeholders fail? And that one is just text contrast. Interesting thing about the contrast requirements in WCAG, they apply to all text. So that since placeholder is text, then it would fail the contrast. The only thing contrast requirements don't apply to is logos. If it's a logo image. If it's a decorative image, like it's just fluff, then it doesn't have to have contrast. Or if it's disabled. If it's a disabled component at the time, it doesn't have to pass the contrast.
And then David Hark asked a question, is FANGs useful?
Good question. I would say no. FANGs, I think that's something from some years back. It was more like a screen reader simulator, as in, this is how the screen reader would probably behave. It was an extension for Firefox. I would say you really need to learn an actual screen reader, like NVDA, because there's no point in learning FANGs when you could just download NVDA, or turn on VoiceOver, or just pull out your iPhone or your Android and learn the real screen reader.
And Claudia asked if you could share a link to your ARIA support matrix.
Yes, I can. And um, I'm hoping that everyone will be able to see this link to my actual slides. And I don't know if this will come through, but I just pasted it into the chat as well. But yeah, all these links are available in the slideshow too.
Screen dimmed.
Oops. I did see a question about screen readers not reading placeholders. They do read placeholders. Screen readers do, but not all of them. If they don't, it's for a particular bug, like maybe on Android with Firefox and TalkBack, but that would be a bug. They should definitely always be reading the screen reader, those placeholders, and they do.
So why don't you keep going,
Okay.
and then we'll come back
Sure.
to some of these comments or questions if we have time. Otherwise, I'll copy all of the comments into the IAAP community so everyone can have access to the comments.
Okay. All right. So here's a date picker. Date pickers are a common accessibility problem. This is a web experience toolkit by the Canadian government. It's an open source project, and I usually always recommend it because it's always mostly accessible.
Internal link. Leading HTML content. Leading link. Internal link. Skip to main content.
They have a skip link. Oops, crash the page.
Application. Problem report for Safari web content. Window. Help button has keyboard Safari. Input IP. This blank. Pick a date from a calendar for field. Start date.
Okay, so here's the date picker.
Close calendar. Escape key with 3 items. Dialog.
So it's telling me it's a dialogue. They do tell me I can close it with the escape key. They've added this sort of text.
You are currently on a dialog. Close calendar. Escape key with 3 items.
It's a little wordy. You see a lot of sort of repetition, but it's accessible.
Previous month. April 2013 button. May 20 blank. Wednesday, May 1 2013. Table 7 columns, 6 rows.
Now, notice it says Wednesday, May 1st, 2013. It doesn't just say 1 or 2, which is a common problem. And I can use arrow keys.
Quick nav off.
I'm turning quick nav off. This is the voiceover thing you need to do.
Blank. Thursday, May 2 2013.
And I can go up and down, left and right. I thought, well,
Blank. Friday, May 3
left and
2013.
right. But it's reading the important information, the day of the week, the month, and
You are currently on a link inside of a cell. To click this link, 20130.
And of course, when I hit enter, my focus went back to somewhere logical. They sent me back into the input, which is really important that they don't lose their focus to the top of the page.
Voiceover off.
And with these date pickers, now I tested on desktop. Does it work on mobile too? That's something that you have to test for. The WET has designed it so on mobile they use Apple's date picker instead of the custom one, but you could use their custom one on mobile and it would still be accessible because they designed it to be accessible. And does it work with the keyboard? That's the major problem. What about background images? How could you give those alt text? Like this complex sort of infographic, disabilities that affect web browsing, that's kind of large for an alt text. So there's lots of ways you could do it. One thing I like is using ARIA to actually, I can make this a div with a role of image and then give it an ARIA label by reference to give it an accessible name. And the screen reader will think it's an image, even though it's really not an image. It's a background image. So let me show you what I'm talking about.
Voiceover on Safari. Disabilities that affect web browsing.
So I did my image navigation, and it skipped the first one and went to the second one because the first one is a background image, not a real image.
Heading. Disabilities that affect web browsing include.
It just uses visually hidden text, and that's okay. I wouldn't say that's not accessible. There's lots of different ways to do this.
Heading level. Disabilities that affect web browsing include 3.2 million users with a visual.
Now this says it's an image. It has a role of image. So that, to me, is more helpful.
Heading level 3. Disabilities that affect.
This one is sort of, different. The focus doesn't look quite as good. But again, it's mostly accessible.
Heading level. Link.
I don't recommend text end at -9000 because that doesn't work on mobile. But for desktop, it does work. But this is an old school method.
Link. Link.
And you can even use ARIA label. If you're dealing with links, any focusable elements, you can modify their name using the ARIA label.
Link. Heading level 3. Disabilities.
And then this is an image with an alt that is short, but then I gave a long description afterwards.
Disabilities that affect.
It's visually hidden, but it's not really programmatically associated.
Heading level.
This one is programmatically associated when I do the help tag.
Disabilities that affect web browsing include.
And that is reading it based on ARIA described by.
Disabilities that affect. Heading level.
So, and I tried long desk. Long desk does not work in a lot of places, but it does work in some places.
Voiceover off.
One thing I want to mention is that CSS icon fonts are a big problem on the iPhone. Let me plug in my headset, sorry. If you see this travel alert error, there's a weird squiggly icon thing, and VoiceOver will speak that out loud. In that it'll say like an emoji rather than the actual text that you want it to read. So to prevent VoiceOver from speaking decorative elements, you need to use ARIA hidden equals true, and that will just say you can't focus on it, you can't speak it. But if you want them to speak it, then you need to give it like an ARIA-label or some sort of accessible name. And you can use CSS-generated content. That is related to these icons being generated by CSS content, and VoiceOver is reading them. So you need to make sure you've tested those icons. Hidden elements, when you open a dialog, it needs to be hidden when it's disabled. The content underneath it should not be readable. So let me show you what I'm talking about here.
Open dialog button.
When I press open dialog button,
Hello world, with 3 items. Dialog.
I don't want to read the other content that's disabled. That would be a failure if you could.
Heading level 1.
I can't get to it because I used ARIA hidden.
Stop interacting with Hello world, leaving HTML. Hello world, with 3 items.
And the only thing I can tap to is the close button. So when I hit spacebar,
Open dialog button.
now I can get around to everything.
Visited.
It's fine.
Open dialog. Hello
It's
world.
not-
Heading level 1.
not once you do
Voiceover
that.
off.
And that is due to the use of ARIA hidden. I said ARIA hidden equals true on the whole sort of container. The other issue is that if I don't put tab index equals -1, I could still tab through these links. And if I didn't say that this input was disabled, then I could still tab through the input itself. So that you have to make sure you're actually hiding content from the screen reader. In alert dialog, this is just another sort of dialog, but it has more of a specific intention in that an alert dialog is to say that there's an error message. And with alert dialogs, I've actually disabled the escape key. You can't hit escape on alert dialog because that's kind of like a JavaScript dialog where you're kind of forced to interact with it. And then when you press enter, then the focus goes back to it. Now, when I open the dialog, because I use role equals alert dialog and ARIA labeled by and ARIA described by, it speaks that information logically. So it spoke the name of the dialog, and then it spoke the button I was focused on because of the use of role equals alert dialog.
Five one two four five eight.
Ooh, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Don't know who that is. Okay. And then for tooltips, again, I've got some examples of tooltip accessibility. You have to make sure the tooltips are spoken when they tab to them. And I do have some working examples that'll show you that. Accordions, they need to have their expanded and collapsed state so that when they're open, you hear it's expanded.
Students, collapsed
And then
button.
when I press spacebar,
Students, expanded button.
now they're expanded.
Internal students, expanded button.
It's very simple. Using ARIA expanded equals true false.
Students, collapsed students, expanded button.
But this is a very common accessibility problem that you have to fix.
You are currently on a button inside.
Menus and mega menus. There's lots of different. I have links to 3 different mega menus that I would say are very accessible. You can use these as demos to show of accessibility, and another one is from the Web Experience Toolkit. So you can use that. It's open source, and also one's from Adobe, which is open source as well. You can actually use these on your sites. Now the autocomplete search suggestions. Let me show yahoo.com so I can show you how this works. Recommended.
Voice up, search text field.
Okay, so let's say type A, B, C.
A, no search suggestions are available. A.
Okay, nothing yet.
B, no search suggestions are available. Ab, C. 1 or more search suggestions are available. Use up or down arrow keys to navigate between them. A, B, C.
So now it's told me there's search suggestions. They're using ARIA to speak information.
You are currently on a text feed. 1 or more search suggestions are available. 1 or more search suggestions. A, B, C, new, period, C, O, mouse dot C.
This is kind of like a bug here.
A, M, I, L, family.
It's not totally enunciated right, but
misspelled. H, warehouse.
this does work sometimes.
E, warehouse. Distributing.
It's just not announcing it perfectly.
Voiceover off.
But my other, the jQuery UI one, that one works even better. jQuery UI is a open source components you can use that have accessibility in them. In our modern accessibility, you need to make sure you're tagging your languages. You're using the language attributes. Like Espanol. Every web page has a little link at the top that says Espanol. But it's spoken like an American who doesn't speak Spanish because they used lang equals en for English rather than lang equals es for Spanish. And, if you haven't seen this demo, I've done them before, but let me show you the language demo because it's pretty cool. And this only works on iOS.
And magic on the internet.
This works with JAWS and NVDA too, but not on the Mac currently.
Then you write the same sentence in French. Mon ordinateur parle français.
Again, because they use a language attribute.
And then in Spanish.
Mi computador habla español.
And in Portuguese.
Meu computador fala português.
So, Apple has a lot of different languages it supports, but if you don't put that attribute on, it's not going to speak it accurately.
Voiceover off.
And then I have tab panel examples. I would say with tab panels, you can make each tab tabbable, like you go tab, 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 or they can work with arrow keys, like right, left, arrow keys, or both, arrow keys and tabs. Most people say the standard is only arrow keys and not tabs, but honestly, I like both, and that's really kind of up to you. It just needs to work with the keyboard and tell you when it's expanded or collapsed. And I have 3 examples here that are accessible. I wanted to talk about regular data tables as well because, you need to make sure that if you're dealing with complex data tables like this one, I have 4 print links. How would I make those unique? I would have to use, data table techniques like headers, possibly, or just the scope. Like this is th scope equals row. This is th scope equals column. So the screen reader should be able to read me both Q2 report print, Q3 report print, print Q4 report. And the caption is 2015 sales report. And if you have more than 3 headers, then you can use the headers attribute itself. And these have been working much better on the Mac now with VoiceOver. And carousels, pause, stop, hide, of course, is the failure for carousels because they don't pause. There's no way to stop them or hide them. A lot of times they're not keyboard operable. Most of the time they're not keyboard operable. So you can use them. I'm not saying don't use the carousels. I'm just saying that they need to work. with the screen reader. And this screenshot here is from the W3C, and it is an accessible carousel, and the Web Experience Toolkit has one as well. I do have a demo for session timeouts. So how do you accessibly time the user out? This is a JavaScript confirm dialog. But that's an example of sort of how you can do a session timeout. I'm running out
And
of
Paul,
time.
speaking
Okay.
of timeout, we are out of time, so I do
Yes.
need you to
And
wrap up.
let's see how many slides I had left. I need to close this window. I don't think I had that many slides left. Oh, actually, no, I didn't. I just had 2 left. Great. So I can finish. Just talking about frameworks like AngularJS and React.js, single-page applications. These are the hot new frameworks in JavaScript that are not accessible most of the time. These frameworks do not give you accessibility most of the time. You have to test it and add it in. And then I just wanted to mention some modern HTML editors to help you with ARIA. Dreamweaver will do autocomplete for code for ARIA attributes. Like you start typing A for alert, and then you can just autocomplete it. Or ARIA dash, and it'll autocomplete dash required for you. So you don't, have to remember how to spell everything perfectly if you're using an editor that has ARIA built in, and I really do like that. But yeah, that's it. Do I have time to answer questions, or do we need to end?
Paul, thank you so much.
Okay, no problem.
We don't have time for questions. I see a quick question about, is there a recording of this presentation? The answer, Anthony, is yes, absolutely. You all will get an email within the next day or two. That will give you the link to the recording for this. It will also let you know that the community, the IAAP community and IAAP Connections is open for this webinar. So what I will do is I'll take the chat from this webinar and I'll put it in the community. And then Paul, what I would ask you to do is if you can review through all of this and see if there are any questions that we didn't get to. And then if you could provide answers in the community to those questions,
yes,
that
definitely.
would be greatly
I'll read
appreciated.
the chat now. Yes.
That sound good? Okay, perfect. So Paul, I want to thank you for doing such a great job. You covered a lot of information in this hour and a half. So wonderful information, and you really did a great job.
Thank you for hosting,
So
serving as a moderator, and all the pre-checks. And really thank you all for coming to learn about ARIA. I really love ARIA. It's one of the most exciting things in accessibility, I think. That and mobile accessibility. So find me on Twitter. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I'll definitely be involved in the community thing to answer any other questions as well.
That's great. Thank you. And I also want to thank you, Annette Blau, who is our captionist. Annette has been doing a great job following with all of this information. Annette is with TCS Associates, so thank you, Annette. And lastly, I just want to let everyone know I've just put a slide up that has a link to our feedback survey. We'll also have a link in the email that we send out within the next day or two. We really appreciate your feedback on both this webinar and also the webinar series and the webinar system in general. So really hope you take the time to provide us your input. And I hope to see you on an upcoming webinar. In July, our webinar topic is mobile accessibility on the move. And then in August, we have EPUB 3, marching to replace PDF as the standard for accessible published materials, and others. And of course, all of this information is on our website at accessibilityassociation.org. So with that, we have come to conclusion. I really appreciate everybody attending today. To log out of today's webinar, all you need to do is close your browser and hang up the phone. It's as simple as that. And I think that's it. So I want to thank everybody. And again, a special thanks to Paul for doing such a great job. So have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day.